My selfish parents want to take the house I worked so hard to buy and hand it over to my golden boy brother, even though they once threw me out of their own home, saying there was no room for me. I should warn you right away that this story is insanely long, way too long to fit into a single hour. But don't worry, it's divided into 9 parts, so you don't have to sit through all of it at once. I honestly don't care if anyone believes me or not, because the whole thing sounds like madness even to me. If someone from my family happens to see this, I don't care either. I'm not going to sugarcoat the truth, but I won't reveal anything that could expose my identity to people who don't know me personally. Part 1 begins when my parents told my brother he should take my house, simply because I don't have a family of my own. I'm in my early 30s and unmarried. My brother, who is 29, already has 4 children. The first came when he was 22, the second a year later, the third 2 years after that, and the youngest was born just a couple of months ago. I never get along with his wife. She constantly acts arrogant, always looking for ways to provoke me. And whenever I react, she immediately plays the victim, bursting into tears and putting on a show to make everyone feel sorry for her. My parents and my brother adore her, even though they know exactly what she's like. They simply don't care. Yes, she's beautiful, but her personality is so awful that I could never feel anything but disgust toward her. On top of that, she refuses to work even though she has a degree. My mother happily spends her days caring for her children, which means the family depends entirely on my brother's income. It also means they can't afford to live anywhere else but my parents' house. With 4 kids and 4 adults crammed into a 3-bedroom place built back in the 60s, there's no such thing as personal space. As a child, I already knew what it meant to be treated unfairly. My younger brother was always the favorite. We're only 3 years apart, but he grew up with a superiority complex because I was punished harshly any time I stood up for myself. It was obvious our parents cared much more about him. He always got what he wanted, unless other relatives started criticizing them, and that happened often enough that my parents decided to move 240 kilometers away from the rest of the family. After that, we only saw them on holidays because the trip took 3 hours. My brother had physically hurt me more than once. He even flirted with my first boyfriend until the relationship collapsed, and he laughed at every failure I ever had. My parents told me to ignore it whenever I got upset. The only time they treated me as an equal was when they needed to keep up appearances in front of relatives. I admit there was a strange sense of satisfaction watching their faces at birthdays or Christmas when they had to pretend I mattered just as much as my brother. Our extended family loved gossip and interference, so my parents always hid what really happened at home. They even threatened to take away all my belongings if I ever told the truth. When I turned 18, they celebrated my leaving because it meant they no longer had to support me. I hadn't even finished school when I moved out. Life on other people's couches was still better than life with them. From then on, I kept my contact with my parents minimal. They didn't even show up at my graduation, but I honestly didn't care. I only saw them and my brother at family holidays. The beginning of the pandemic in 2020 hit me hard. I lost my job and couldn't afford to renew my lease. My roommate also lost his job, and together we couldn't keep up with the rent. It was a 2-bedroom apartment I loved, but when the lease ended, he left early to stay with relatives. I had to sell almost everything I owned just to avoid homelessness. The truth is, I should never have rented such an expensive place, but I enjoyed living large until reality taught me otherwise. I realized I should have chosen something cheaper and saved money for emergencies. Still, I had a plan. I owned a pickup truck, and I bought a used camper for $1,000 in good enough shape to live in for a while. It was meant to be temporary, but I ended up staying there much longer than planned. At first, I hoped to park on my parents' property where my brother's family also lived. But when I asked, they said their house was already too crowded and they didn't want me around. We hadn't gotten along for years anyway. They told me I could stay only if I paid them the same rent as an apartment in their area. That was far too much money just to park my truck. I was unemployed and trying to survive on unemployment benefits until I found work. For the price they demanded, I could have rented an actual apartment. My parents called my camper an eyesore and told me to leave since we couldn't agree on payment. My sister-in-law mocked me, and my brother joined in, pointing at me and calling me a homeless bum. That first night, I parked at a store lot. I was terrified, convinced someone would try to break in. I barely slept. I had nowhere else to go, since relatives lived far away and my friends only had apartments. I was too attached to my area to leave. I even had to forward my mail to a friend's address just to keep receiving it. Finding a stable place to park was harder than I thought. I spent months searching for jobs like the one I had before, but no one hired me. In that time, I dealt with beggars, addicts, and angry people who demanded I move because my camper ruined their view. One man claimed to represent a homeowners association and told me to leave, even though I wasn't parked near condos. When I asked what association he meant, he grew aggressive and threatened me. I drove away just to avoid trouble. I adapted, using an extension cord to plug into random outlets when I could. It wasn't right, but I needed to keep my fridge running. I had a small solar panel for my phone, but no generator, and generators were noisy and expensive to fuel. I survived however I could. After long months of this life, I finally found a job in a neighboring city. It wasn't retail work, and that alone felt like a small victory. I had promised myself never to return to retail, though at times I came close to breaking that promise. Even with unemployment benefits, I had no housing. I was bored out of my mind most days, with nothing but books, a small DVD player, my phone, or my laptop to pass the time. I kept notes on where I could park and which public restrooms I could use. I even envied Japan for their public bathhouses, something we desperately needed here. When I finally landed a new job, I practically lived on the company's backlot. There were old parking spaces nobody used anymore, far from the building. My boss, the owner, actually liked the arrangement. I was always available for extra shifts, and he even let me remove the camper from my truck bed and leave it there so I could drive freely. I wasn't sure if it was legal, but no one stopped me. I worked nearly every day, and I was always on call if needed. My boss let me hook up my camper to power and water from the building. In return, I worked Sundays for free, when only the janitor and the night guard were around. I usually showered at a friend's apartment or at the gym since my camper didn't have one. I had a small portable toilet but hated using it, so I relied on public restrooms whenever possible. I had a key to the warehouse and could use the restroom there anytime. I even became friends with the night guard, who turned into one of my closest allies. Heating the camper in winter was easy with a small electric heater, but summer was unbearable, so I bought a used portable air conditioner just to survive the heat. I earned a lot of money working overtime and learned new skills from co-workers. By mid-year, I finally got promoted, became a manager, and started making real money. That was when I realized I wanted to buy a house. The fear I felt when I couldn't pay rent pushed me to understand I needed something stable, something that was truly mine. I began searching and found a one-story home with 3 bedrooms and a small yard, only 3 kilometers from work. I even negotiated the price down by $10,000. I poured nearly all my savings into the down payment and got approved for a mortgage. At last, I didn't have to live in a camper anymore. There was plenty of space behind the house to park my truck and drop off the camper, so I kept it there just in case I ever needed it again. Once I fully settled in, I made the mistake of posting about my achievement on social media. My family saw it, and that was when everything began to unravel. A few weeks later, my parents, my brother, and his wife showed up at my doorstep uninvited, ready for a tour of my home. I had never given them my address, so to this day, I don't know how they found it. None of my friends admitted telling them. I suspect they followed me from work, and honestly, that wouldn't surprise me. The moment I opened the door, they barged in like noisy tourists. They walked around as if they owned the place, and my sister-in-law kept smirking at me with this nasty look in her eyes. At the time, I didn't understand why, but soon it became painfully clear. My parents kept talking about how much space I had, repeating that it was far too much for a single woman without a husband or children. My brother kept pointing out that my home was bigger than our parents and much closer to his work. Finally, he asked to speak with me alone. Everyone else suddenly stepped outside onto the patio, and that's when I knew they had planned something. My brother, let's call him Dan, said the house was too big for me alone, and that I should let him move in with his family since his wife was already pregnant with their fourth child, and my place was closer to his job. He even said I already had a camper, so I could just live in it out back while they took over my home. He never once mentioned paying rent, even though he had a decent job. Then he started laying out rules for me, saying there would be curfews and that I couldn't enter the house whenever I wanted without permission. If it hadn't been my own brother, I would have thought the man was insane. He spoke to me as if I had no say at all. But I had never planned on renting my house to anyone, especially not to him and his arrogant wife. I had read stories online about situations like this, but I never thought I'd be living one myself. My parents, my brother, and my sister-in-law fit every description of narcissistic, self-absorbed people. I pulled out my phone and started recording. Dan didn't notice and kept waving his hands, listing all the reasons why my home should be his. Then he tried to shake my hand, as if the deal was already done. That was the moment I finally stood firm. I said no, and I said it so loudly that he actually stepped back for a second. I rarely raised my voice with him because growing up my parents punished me for it. But this was my house, not theirs. Here I had power. I stood up and told him that my home was not for rent, not for him, not for anyone. The fact that our parents wanted it meant nothing. I bought this house for myself. It wasn't my fault he kept having kids and still lived with our parents because he couldn't afford his own place. Dan moved closer, stopping just short of touching me, and told me I didn't deserve the house, that his family needed it more. I laughed right in his face. I had worked hard to earn it, and of course, I deserved it. He began screaming that since I had no husband and no children, I didn't need all that space and I should let him have it. But I refused. He hadn't even offered rent. If I let them move in, I would still be stuck paying the mortgage on a house I couldn't even live in. Then came his final argument. He shouldn't have to pay anything because we were family, and our parents said I had to give him the house. I shouted back that their word wasn't law, and they had no right to decide what happened with my property. Right on cue, my parents and sister-in-law rushed back inside, surrounding me and pushing me to agree. They kept yelling, repeating the same phrase over and over, "Do this for Dan." The shouting escalated until I finally told them they had no right to interfere in my life and that they needed to leave or I would call the police. My sister-in-law screamed that she was pregnant and I couldn't treat her this way. I told her she had no reason to think she could take whatever she wanted from me, as if I would just hand it over. I added that I wasn't responsible for her or her family. Then I called her out for exactly what she was, an arrogant woman who had never respected me. I said I didn't care how many kids she had. She would not live in my house. Her words pushed her over the edge, and she lunged at me. She managed to land one hit to my face and tried to strike again, but my brother held her back while she screamed to be let go so she could scratch my eyes out. I held up my phone, still recording everything, and warned them I would call the police if they didn't leave immediately. My parents told Dan they were leaving and started walking out. On the way, my mother turned and gave me a so-called ultimatum, 1 week to change my mind. I told her flat out that I never would, and they shouldn't come back. After that, I looked straight at my sister-in-law and told her the recording was proof, and if she ever tried anything, I would file charges for assault. She screamed, ran out of the house, and left crying with her hands over her face. My mother was the last to go, repeating one more time that I had to do it for Dan. I told her it would never happen. Part 2 began when my parents decided to take my home for my brother anyway. They even broke the locks while I was gone. I know there are stories like this all over the internet, and yes, I've read them too. But that doesn't mean one person has the monopoly on this kind of madness. Still, I don't blame anyone who thinks my story is nonsense. In their place, I would think the same. By now, though, you should already see how rotten my parents were, because they created all the problems in my life and raised my brother into the entitled man he is today. They never once gave me a clear explanation why they treated us so differently. And honestly, I don't think there is one. Some parents simply pick a favorite child and stick with it no matter what. That's exactly what mine did, and I ended up wrecking their world because of it. Not legally, but emotionally. After I kicked them, my brother and his wife, out of my house, I went straight to social media and told all our relatives what had just happened. I put it out there for everyone to see because I knew the first thing my parents would do was twist the story to make me the villain. And I was right, but I had almost an hour's head start, and I had video proof. My plan worked. Some relatives immediately reached out in support. My parents, my brother, and his wife probably planned to push their version. But by then, it was too late, and they didn't even try that hard. A few relatives still backed them, but most already knew what kind of people they were, so it wasn't hard to connect the dots. One person even called me, shouting at the top of his lungs that I was a terrible sister and had to give in to the real family man. I hung up and blocked the number. That was the end of it. A week later, my parents returned with Dan, just as they had promised. They rang the bell and pounded on my door like maniacs until I cracked it open. They tried to shove their way in, but I had installed chains and even pressed my body against the door to keep them out. My father and brother demanded to be let inside. I told them I was recording everything and would call the police if they forced it. My mother tried to calm them and then, in her syrupy tone, asked if I was ready to let my brother move in. I told her and the rest to get lost and never come back. She started fake crying, asking why I couldn't do it for Dan since he was my beloved brother. I laughed and said I didn't love him at all. He had treated me like garbage for years, and they encouraged it. They were awful parents and he was a horrible brother. I ordered them to leave, or I'd call the police on the spot. Strangely enough, they left without much of a fight, except for my mother's loud sobbing and the angry looks they all shot at me. Someone else might have thought it was too easy, but I didn't yet realize they had another plan waiting. That Friday evening, when I came home, I found a moving truck and my brother's minivan parked in front. Dan and his family were unloading boxes, and when he saw me, he just waved with a stupid grin. I was furious and told them to stop, but my sister-in-law smugly announced that whether I liked it or not, they were moving in. She even tilted her head, pouted her lips, and said my mommy had given them permission, and that I should always listen to my mommy. I was boiling with rage, locked myself inside my pickup, and immediately called the police. When they realized what I was doing, she started pounding on my window, yelling that I couldn't treat them this way because they needed the house. She screamed again, asking why I couldn't just do it for Dan. I shouted back that it was my damn house, not his. Then she threatened to scratch my truck if I didn't hang up. The 911 operator heard everything since my window was cracked open. I told her if she damaged my truck, I would sue her. Luckily, she backed down. When the police arrived, Dan and his wife locked themselves inside my home with their kids. I showed the officers my driver's license with the correct address and explained everything that had happened. At the front door, I saw they had changed the locks. The old lock was lying on the porch with the core drilled out, and right next to it was the drill and a full set of bits. Could they have been any dumber, leaving evidence in plain sight? I pointed to the lock and drill, then gave the police a rundown of all the events leading up to this. Not long after, Dan must have called our parents, because they showed up while I was talking to the officers. My parents immediately started lying, claiming I had agreed to rent the house to my brother and his family. I told them that was a lie, and I could prove it. Then Dan and his wife finally came out of my house, holding some papers, looking smug, as if they had somehow outsmarted me. It turned out they had actually typed and printed a fake rental agreement. There was even a signature on it, but it clearly wasn't mine. None of them had ever seen my real signature, so the forgery looked ridiculous. I told my parents and Dan this was fraud, and if the police investigated, it would be obvious. I reminded them that prison and court would ruin their lives, and Dan could even lose his job, the only income his family had. I added that if any of my property was stolen or damaged, I would hire a lawyer, sue them, and call Child Protective Services for good measure. Dan went pale when he heard that, but my mother stepped in, still insisting that I had to do this for Dan, as if I should move back into the camper so they could finally live in a proper house. I snapped and shouted that if she thought it was such a great idea, she should do it for Dan and give him her house. The officers pulled my mother back, and I told them all to leave right then, or I would press charges. I made it clear they had broken into my home, drilled out my lock, forged rental papers with a fake signature, and that I had video of my sister-in-law attacking me. These were crimes that could destroy their lives if I chose to push it. The only reason I hadn't yet was because of Dan's kids. They had one chance to walk away. When my parents heard that, they finally seemed to realize they couldn't force me anymore. My mother gave up, saying she would end it. She spoke quietly to my sister-in-law while my father pulled Dan aside. Suddenly, she started crying loudly, tearing up the fake papers into little pieces and tossing them around like confetti. The officer immediately told her to pick it up or face a fine. Dan had to tell his kids to start carrying boxes back to the truck. The children cried, the oldest sobbing over losing the promise of his own room. My brother and his wife tried one last pathetic performance, staging a family huddle on my lawn. All the kids looked at me with trembling lips. My sister-in-law stroked her pregnant belly, tilting her head to look like a sad puppy. And Dan put on the most pitiful face he could manage. They wanted me to feel guilty. I didn't flinch. When they begged, I told them to keep packing. They all cried harder, and Dan shouted at me, accusing me of being selfish. I laughed in his face and told him he didn't want to share. He wanted to steal. No amount of tears would ever change my mind. He wasn't my brother anymore. He was just a narcissist who thought he could take whatever he wanted, just like when we were kids. Dan cursed me out until the police warned him to calm down or they'd put him in handcuffs. His face twisted in rage and fear. I asked the officers to stay until my parents, my brother, and his wife were gone. More police even showed up, which pressured them to move faster. I forced Dan to hand me the keys to the new lock he'd installed. The next day, I changed it anyway, unsure if they had copies. At first, he tried to be clever, throwing the keys into a storm drain. The officer scolded him and made him crawl down to fish them out. Covered in dirt, he threw them at me before storming off. I told all of them to leave and never come back. My mother declared she would disown me. I laughed and told her I didn't care, mocking the idea of missing family holidays where I was always treated like trash because Dan was the favorite. They were stunned. Even the officers looked at them with disgust. For the first time, my parents had no way to talk over me. I told them exactly what I thought about the years of abuse, the way they enabled Dan, how they mocked me for living in a camper, how they tried to steal my home while once refusing to let me park on their land when I was homeless. The police stared them down as I reminded them that when I finally had something good in life, they wanted to take it away to give it to their favorite child. I told them I owed them nothing. Not then, not ever. My father flushed with shame. My mother cried that she was a terrible person, and I agreed she was. They all were, and I told them hell was waiting for people like them. Normally, they would have exploded, but with 4 police officers present, they stood silent. My mother buried her face in my father's shoulder, and Dan stayed quiet while his kids finished loading boxes. My sister-in-law staged another breakdown on my lawn before finally being forced to leave. Once they were gone, I made sure none of my belongings were missing. Honestly, I didn't own much yet, just a couch, but at least it was still there. They drove off, my sister-in-law glaring at me until Dan pulled her away. As soon as they were gone, I went online again and posted everything. This time, my parents were too embarrassed to defend themselves. The family had been divided before, but after this, almost everyone took my side. Those who didn't openly support me simply stayed neutral. No matter how many times my parents repeated that it was all for Dan, no one was listening anymore. To my surprise, even relatives who had once backed my parents switched sides and supported me. I felt such relief, especially when I offered to host part of the family for Christmas at my new home. Needless to say, my parents weren't invited. To my surprise, neither my brother nor his wife blocked me on social media. Thanks to that, I found out in early November that my sister-in-law had given birth to their fourth child. They were still living with my parents, and I was almost sure they knew I kept an eye on their posts. She kept putting up passive-aggressive updates every couple of weeks about how cramped it was in my parents' house, clearly aimed at me to spark guilt. I'm sure it drove my parents crazy, too. They had wanted peace in their later years, but instead they were stuck in a crowded house with 3 noisy kids, a newborn, and a volatile daughter-in-law. Maybe they should have parked a camper in the backyard and given Dan their whole house. They could have done it for Dan. Part 3 began when my parents, my brother, and his wife showed up at my home for Christmas, even though they knew they weren't invited. For those who said I should install cameras, I plan to once I can afford them. I'm still recovering financially from buying my house, and from what I know, good cameras need decent computer storage, while all I have is a 3-year-old laptop with Windows 10. Sure, I know about smart doorbells. That will be my first purchase. And for everyone asking why I didn't just have my brother and his wife arrested, my only reason was their kids. They needed their parents. If Dan had been arrested, he might have lost his job, and then his family would have had nothing, especially with a newborn at home. No, they didn't belong in prison. My revenge didn't need to go that far. Would I be that merciful again? Probably not, and they know it. My sister-in-law's passive-aggressive posting only increased after November. She kept rewording the same complaints, how she was tired of living with my parents, how little space they had, how she needed her own home. I admitted to myself that I was attached to living in this area. The job market was better here, and I wanted to make it on my own. That explanation was accepted, and soon we were enjoying one of the best Christmases I'd had in years. For the first time in a long time, I felt happy. But of course, that peace didn't last. My uncle, my mother's brother, stood up during the gathering and said my parents and Dan didn't deserve to be in my home after everything they had tried to pull. Several other relatives supported him. This was huge, because he had once adored my mom before learning the truth about what she had done to me all my life. My grandparents, my mom's parents, also stepped in. They told my parents that if they ever wanted a chance at reconciliation with me, it wasn't the time. They were more disappointed in them than ever before. They even told my parents that if they wanted to be part of my life again, they'd have to finally treat me as their daughter and not a disposable shadow. Then they turned to Dan and his wife, pointing out the endless social media posts she had made. They told her to let it go, that my house would never be hers. My sister-in-law immediately collapsed into tears, whining that it was unfair, that I had a home while she had 4 kids in cramped space. She claimed she only wanted better conditions for her children. I snapped back, telling her she was a terrible mother because my mother did more parenting for those kids than she ever did. She just drank, scrolled on her phone, and spent Dan's money. Yes, I went too far. I even joked that it was a miracle her baby wasn't drunk from her breast milk. Everyone stared at me, shocked, but when she demanded to know if I really thought she was a bad mother, I told her the facts spoke for themselves. If she wanted to move out of my parents' house someday, she should use her degree, get a job, and finally learn how to manage money. At that moment, Dan's oldest son, 7 years old, ran up to me, kicking and yelling that I was awful for insulting his mom. He screamed that she had told him I was the bad person who wouldn't let them live here. Dan had to drag his son away, and once again the rest of the family jumped in. this time against Dan and his wife. She cried, her newborn cried, her kids cried, and even Dan looked on the verge of tears as his entire reputation crumbled. He slumped down on a small bench near the door, completely defeated, unable to look at anyone. If we had been alone, I bet he would have tried to order me to hand over my house again. But with the whole family against him, he sat there broken. Eventually, my parents, my brother, and his wife left in total humiliation. The party went on without them, and we avoided mentioning the drama for the rest of the night. Since most of the adults had been drinking, everyone stayed over, and I even let some guests sleep in the camper. They couldn't believe I had lived in it for almost 2 years, and honestly, it made a great guest house. I woke up early on Christmas morning, made coffee, and set out ibuprofen for anyone with a hangover. Everyone said I was a better host than my parents ever were. We agreed to celebrate Christmas at my house again the next year. Afterward, my sister-in-law finally stopped posting her passive-aggressive digs, even deleting old ones. But after New Year's, she slipped again. She wrote that she had tried to convince my parents to buy a camper like mine so they could live in the backyard while Dan's family took the house. I heard my parents rejected the idea instantly, furious at the suggestion. The post disappeared in a couple of days, and since then, she's been quiet online. By then, it was clear nothing would change. Dan couldn't afford to move out anytime soon, and if they had another kid in the next few years, I wouldn't even be surprised. Since that Christmas, they've kept their distance. My parents went back to acting like I didn't exist, which was fine by me. In fact, it was better. But I know them. They'll come back into my life sooner or later. The only question is how ridiculous their next attempt will be. Part 4 began when my parents and Dan returned sooner than I expected. This time, it wasn't about a house. It was about money. It turned out Dan's credit history was a mess. Shocking, right? Maybe it had something to do with his wife draining his money nonstop. He asked me to either help financially or co-sign a lease and cover rent with him. I refused both. Dan exploded, shouting that I owed it to him to sacrifice for his family since I didn't have one of my own. I laughed in his face and asked where they had been when I needed help. Oh, that's right. They laughed at me when I was homeless. Or maybe I should bring up our childhood. I said I'd be happy to discuss that in detail with so many people listening around us. My mother grabbed my hand, begging me not to go down that road. My father and Dan just turned away in silence. I asked them if they thought I was rich. Their faces said it all. When I explained I didn't have that kind of money, they looked shocked. I broke it down for them, how I saved for my down payment, how I practically lived at work just to make it happen, and how I was still climbing out of financial strain. Yes, I had some money left each month, but most of it went into savings. I asked Dan his yearly income, and when he answered, I pointed out it was slightly higher than mine. Then I explained to my parents that around 70% of my income disappeared into my mortgage, insurance, gas, food, phone, internet, and other bills. The rest, maybe 30%, I put away for emergencies. I reminded them my pickup was a 1990 model, and if it broke down, I'd need repair money or enough for a new car. A house needs repairs, too. Doctors, taxes, legal fees, life comes with surprise costs. I told them straight, I couldn't spare money for Dan, and I refused to co-sign, because that would make me responsible for whatever rent Dan didn't pay. I added that maybe that was the real reason my parents weren't signing for him either. My mother burst into tears again, but I was one step ahead of them this time. I told them clearly I am not an ATM and I am not a fool. I braced for my father's usual rage, his explosions when I didn't agree with my brother. But it never came. For the first time, his face didn't carry anger or smugness. It showed regret. Regret for being a terrible parent, maybe. Or regret because he knew he couldn't intimidate me anymore. Whatever it was, they had no argument left, and I wasn't giving them a dime. Dan finally stood up and called the whole thing a waste of time. My mother tried to apologize for him, but he was already storming off. To kill them with kindness, I offered to buy lunch since we were already there. They didn't say no to free food, so they stayed. Dan sat quietly, eating or glued to his phone. My parents made small talk and even told me they had joined a local church 2 weeks earlier. They invited me too, but I politely declined. When we finished eating, Dan tossed $10 on the table for a tip and walked out without saying a word. My mother apologized again on his behalf, and we all left. That was it. Not nearly as dramatic as I had expected. As for my sister-in-law, she kept whining online about my parents. Apparently, she hated that she wasn't the boss in their home, and her toxicity was finally starting to wear them down. She even wanted my parents to move into a camper so she and Dan could take the whole house. They refused every time. Of course, she had her little fan club. Strangers messaged me, furious that I didn't give her my house. I stopped arguing with them, just blocked and moved on. One troll even got my phone number and called from different lines. I'm sure it was the same man who once screamed at me to give in to the real family man, Dan. But the calls grew fewer and eventually stopped. Meanwhile, I set up cameras at my house, including a video doorbell. I didn't tell my family about them, just in case, but so far, no one has tried breaking in again. I rented out 2 rooms in my house, one to a close friend, another to his buddy. Both were great guys, quiet, respectful, even bought mini fridges for their rooms to keep out of the main kitchen. I gave them such a good deal they couldn't say no, and it boosted my income a lot. Even after taxes, I was saving much more each month, since their rent covered a big part of my mortgage. How did my family react when they found out? Badly. My father and Dan said nothing, but my sister-in-law went ballistic. My mother came crying, saying I should have rented those rooms to Dan and his family instead. We argued, and I reminded her they had literally broken into my home and changed my locks. Did she really think I'd ever let people like that move in with me? Besides, 3 bedrooms are not enough space for me, Dan, his wife, and 4 kids. I had the master with its own bathroom, leaving only 2 small rooms, and I couldn't survive under the same roof as my sister-in-law anyway. She lived to provoke me, and they had mocked me when I was homeless. My 2 bachelor roommates in their 30s were 1,000 times easier to live with. My mother eventually admitted she was desperate. How did they even know I was renting rooms? My sister-in-law had been spying on me and reported back. That's how the whole family found out. Since then, my parents haven't brought up the house again. And honestly, things were going well for me. While their lives were falling apart, my sister-in-law turned out to be even worse than I thought. Manipulative, dramatic, yes, but now also unfaithful. The youngest child wasn't even Dan's. She cheated, which, in hindsight, wasn't surprising. She was caught red-handed, kicked out, and Dan filed for divorce. Thankfully, we live in a state where fault divorces exist, so the case was in his favor. He even got his name removed from the baby's birth certificate. After that Christmas disaster, their world only spiraled further. Of course, she blamed me for everything. She told anyone who would listen that I was rich, like I had won the lottery, and that I owed her. Apparently, she was the one who pushed my parents and Dan to crash my Christmas party, hoping I would give in. And she was the mastermind behind asking me for money to cover rent. But when Dan and my parents learned the truth about my finances, her fantasy collapsed. If anything, that night at my house not only ruined their reputations, but finally made my parents stop listening to her. And as I mentioned before, my parents went back to church, maybe because I once told them they were going to hell. I don't know, but it was satisfying to imagine that might be why. After 2 decades away from faith, they even came to my house without Dan to apologize in person. They had read the first 3 parts of my story online, and yes, they know everything I've written here. They hated it, but they had no choice but to face the truth. For once, I saw my father actually apologize. For once, my father's apology felt real. He wasn't a good actor, and the regret in his voice sounded genuine. My parents admitted everything they had done to me and said there was no excuse for it. They even called themselves narcissists and acknowledged how deeply they had hurt me. Then they started blaming my sister-in-law for a lot of things. Sure, she had caused plenty of chaos, but it wasn't all on her. My parents had their share of guilt too. They told me they'd been seeing a therapist and even suggested family counseling together. I wasn't ready for that yet, so I said no. Dan never apologized, but whenever the past came up, he looked painfully ashamed. Meanwhile, his marriage completely collapsed. My sister-in-law finally showed her true colors, and both Dan and my parents realized she wasn't who they thought she was. But of course, she didn't stop. She started showing my parents ads for used RVs, insisting they should buy one and live in it so Dan could take their house. She even claimed they should travel the country like normal retirees. It was insane, even for her. My parents turned it around and told her maybe she and Dan should get an RV. She scoffed, saying it was impossible because she was a mother. When she didn't get her way, she grabbed her baby and stormed out, disappearing for days. They knew she was safe. Her phone was still on, and she answered with short, passive-aggressive texts. When she finally returned, she was even more bitter, furious that no one had caved while she was gone. She stopped going to church, but Dan started attending with our parents, bringing the kids, except the baby, because she refused to let him take the infant anywhere. I never joined. I believe in God, sure, but church never did anything for me as a kid. Part 6 was when Dan finally learned the truth about his wife. For reference, Dan and I both have straight black hair, just like our parents. His wife also had straight dark hair, but the baby's hair was blonde and curly. At first, Dan assumed it would darken with age, but it never did. That was the biggest red flag. He confronted her with a DNA test in front of our parents. She broke down in tears, insisting it was a lab mistake. She cycled through every trick: denial, partial confession, manipulation. But Dan wasn't buying it. He dug deeper than I thought he ever would. He had phone records, texts from her phone, bank statements, and the DNA test. He even identified her lover, the likely father, who just happened to have blonde curly hair. The evidence was overwhelming, and Dan admitted she hadn't even bothered to hide her affair well. My parents demanded she leave their house immediately. That's when she snapped. She screamed, clawed at Dan and my father with her fake nails, and even struck her oldest son when he tried to intervene. My mom had to call the police. Dan had the whole thing recorded on his phone, so the officers had plenty of proof to arrest her for assault. Her parents came to bail her out and collect her baby, her belongings, and her car. A few days later, she showed up at my doorstep, apparently deciding I was her next target. The moment I opened the door, she went on a rant, blaming me for writing about everything online and calling me her biggest enemy. Her eyes looked wild, almost unnatural, like she was on something. She shouted that mothers with children were sacred and that giving her my house would have been the least I could do to support family. She raved that if I had done that, her family would still be together. When I tried to speak, she shoved at me and even raised her hand like she might scratch me. But I wasn't scared. I told her to back off or I'd call the police, and that my doorbell camera had recorded everything. The second I said camera, she panicked. I laid into her, tearing her down with words she couldn't ignore. I reminded her she didn't work, cheated on her husband, lived off my mother's childcare, burned through Dan's money, and still acted like my house was hers. I called her the ultimate narcissist, selfish beyond measure, and told her to stop blaming me for her mess. I warned her never to show up at my home again. She stormed off, screeching out of my driveway. That was it for me. I finally went to the police, filed charges for harassment and assault from last year, and added her latest meltdown to the record. I even gave Dan copies of the footage for his divorce lawyer. The restraining order was granted without question. From then on, she left me alone. She kept seeing her lover during the divorce, but I didn't know much about him at the time. Honestly, anyone willing to wreck a marriage and father a baby with a married woman wasn't exactly a moral man. In court, she admitted Dan wasn't a real man anymore because he couldn't give her the life she wanted. She claimed she was a trophy wife and deserved better. Dan laughed in her face, telling her she wasn't nearly beautiful enough for that title, and pointing out her flaws one by one. She was humiliated again. Cut off from Dan's money, she had to move back with her parents and work in their family business. With a criminal record and a 10-year gap on her resume, no one else would hire her. She had maxed out every credit card Dan had given her, and her own parents were bitterly disappointed. In the end, the divorce blew up in her face. She walked away with nothing, no money, no husband, no house, because she cheated, attacked her family, and carried on with her lover. The judge ruled against her. Part 7 begins with the court drama that followed. She even brought her lover to the hearings, hoping he could charm the judge. He tried to paint her as a victim of a failed marriage, but it backfired spectacularly. Once we saw her true nature, we couldn't even be sure she ever loved Dan at all. It felt like she only used him as a paycheck. Many people in the comments guessed she probably kept having kids just to avoid working. And, honestly, they were probably right. She tried to stall the divorce, but Dan's lawyer and the judge didn't let it happen. With all the evidence stacked against her, pretending to be the victim was pointless. So she dropped the act and showed her full venom in court. Every record, every police report, every video was there to prove she was a cruel narcissist. She fought, but it was hopeless. In the settlement, Dan took on 3/4 of the credit card debt and removed his name from the baby's birth certificate. She got partial custody of the kids with no child support and was left with most of her own debts to manage. Because she was officially employed at her parents' business, she had an income to cover at least some of it. She was allowed to see the kids, even have them on weekends, but she barely tried. A couple of fast food outings, no overnight stays. You'd think her parents would want to be part of their grandkids' lives, but they never reached out to Dan. They hadn't visited before, and now it seemed they never would. As for Dan, he had truly loved his wife, and her betrayal shattered him. He started drinking. The night he confronted her about the affair, he showed up at my place with a bottle of whiskey in his hand and scratches across his face. He wasn't blackout drunk, but seeing him like that scared me. I scolded him for driving under the influence, but that didn't matter compared to the pain of betrayal. We spent hours in my camper so we wouldn't bother my renters. He drank from the bottle and sobbed, calling himself a fool for marrying that witch. From that night on, whenever he mentioned her, it was only the witch. Strangely, those hours were the closest we had been in 15 years. He didn't exactly apologize to me, but he called himself a terrible man with awful taste in women and admitted I hadn't made the same mistakes he had. Despite everything, he was still my little brother. I couldn't let him drive home like that, so I made him stay the night. I took his car keys and set up a bed in the camper, since the spare rooms were full. He was broken, didn't want his kids or our parents to see him like that, and honestly, I was afraid of what he might do if I let him go. About a month after the split, Dan asked to borrow my camper. He said that when his wife left, he gave his bedroom to his oldest son, an 8-year-old boy who had been stuck sharing space with his sisters. The kid had been sleeping on the couch to avoid them, and I knew he desperately wanted his own room. Dan decided to be a good dad and asked if he could move into the camper so his son could finally have that space. I gave in. No rent, no conditions, except that they'd be financially responsible for any damage. I took photos and videos of the camper inside and out, and Dan even recorded a clip agreeing to the terms. The camper had been my home for years, almost a part of me, but I let it go because of the kids. I've grown attached to them, and they've grown attached to me. They light up when I visit, and I've even babysat them a few times. With their mother gone, they've become kinder, especially toward me. I finally started enjoying being an aunt. Dan's divorce lawyer eventually forced his ex to admit the truth and amend the baby's birth certificate. Her lover took legal and financial responsibility. Later, through his attorney, he told Dan he'd left her and didn't want any more trouble. I checked the guy's social media. He complained bitterly about being stuck paying for a child he never wanted. He was in his early 40s but looked younger, which explained the whole mess. So maybe this was the end. My ex-sister-in-law was gone from our lives. My parents and Dan were finally trying to change. I was surprisingly happy in my role as an aunt, and most importantly, my home was still mine. Part 8 began when she discovered my posts. And yes, she was furious. With the restraining order in place, she couldn't confront me directly. She couldn't even afford a lawyer anymore. So she complained to Dan, demanding he force me to delete everything. Dan had read my posts too, but instead of siding with her, he said he was fine with them. He told me they reminded him of the awful person he used to be. My parents also tried to treat me and Dan equally now, though my father stayed quiet around me. Someone suggested he simply didn't know how to talk to me after so many years of playing favorites. Honestly, I think that's true, but it doesn't bother me. My mother, on the other hand, had developed a habit of apologizing constantly for the smallest things. Dan said both she and Dad had been criticized a lot by relatives and their therapist, and now my mom overcompensated with nonstop apologies. A huge change from how she used to treat me. When my ex-sister-in-law learned Dan had moved into my camper so his son could have a room, she mocked him. She called him a homeless bum. But Dan didn't care. He told her he was living there because he put his children first, something she had never done. She had only used them as tools, avoiding work and emotionally blackmailing everyone around her. That was early in their divorce. Dan later told me she had a full meltdown over my posts, but by then, no one was listening to her anymore. No one ever tried to contact me on her behalf to demand I take my posts down, so she'll just have to live with her well-deserved shame. Lately, she's been acting a little nicer toward Dan, probably because living with her own parents isn't nearly as fun as she imagined. Dan tolerates her visits because she's the mother of his kids, but that's as far as it goes. He told me he could never see her the same way again. The thought of her disgusts him, so reconciliation is off the table. Then came the egg incident. I suspected it was her, but I couldn't prove it. My cameras caught someone bundled up in layers of heavy clothes, wearing oversized glasses and hiding the rest of their face under a scarf. The figure walked to my house. No car, no license plate to trace. About her height, yes, but that wasn't enough to call it proof. If it was her, she knew about the cameras, which is why covering up was probably the smartest thing she had done in years. At around 3 a.m, while I was fast asleep, that person pelted my pickup with at least a dozen eggs. They ran off as soon as they were done. There wasn't any major damage, just a sticky mess. By the time I noticed it in the morning, I drove to a car wash during my lunch break. $15 later, most of it was gone. Eggs can harm paint, but my truck is from the 90s. It's far from pristine anyway. I still took photos, filed a police report, and submitted my camera footage as evidence. So far, nothing has come of it. The officers brushed it off like it was just kids pulling a prank. Maybe they're overworked, maybe they didn't care. Either way, there wasn't much harm done besides the annoyance and a wasted $15. If it was my ex-sister-in-law, then at least she was smart enough to throw eggs instead of slashing tires or scratching the paint. Honestly, that might be the only time she ever put her college degree to good use. I held off on posting about it right away, thinking maybe something else would happen. But nothing has. Things have been quiet. For now. If you've made it this far, thank you for sticking with me through this crazy ride. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe. It really helps me keep sharing my stories. And here's my question for you. What would you have done if your own family tried to steal your home for the golden child? Would you have cut them off completely or tried to forgive them? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one.